Hey church, and welcome to this week's small group. Now we're going to have a small group about Thanksgiving. And I know what you're thinking. Why are we still talking about Thanksgiving? This holiday happened last week already. But here's the deal. If we are believers in Jesus, Thanksgiving needs to be more than just a holiday once a year. It needs to become a part of our lifestyle. And so this week, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the benefits of having a life defined by thankfulness. So let's start out with two questions. What was the most memorable Thanksgiving of your life, and what made it so memorable? Now, hopefully you didn't have like a horrible Thanksgiving this last week, and that's what made it so memorable. So hopefully maybe that was well in the past. But the second question is, what moment in your life reminds you the most of God's goodness toward you? Sometimes the best way to learn is by learning from a bad example. This last Sunday we talked about a good example of remembering God's faithfulness and having thanksgiving for that. But today we're actually going to review a time in the Israelites' history in which they were a bad example of that. We're going to look at the Israelites right after they were released from slavery in Egypt. And they had seen miracle after miracle as God had sent the plagues upon Egypt to soften Pharaoh up so that Pharaoh would release them. But when the Israelites were released, God went out before them. There was a pillar of cloud by day. There was a pillar of fire by night to lead them and to guide them. But then they hit some of the most scary trouble that they had ever seen in their entire life. I want you to read Exodus chapter 14, verses 5 through 9. And why do you think Pharaoh changed his mind about letting the Israelites go? And if you were an Israelite in this story, and you saw the most formidable army in the world coming after you, how would you respond? I think there's probably numerous reasons why Pharaoh changed his mind. Probably ego, fear that his own fame would be cut short, needing the Israelites to work. And even, I think, the fact that he thought that they were vulnerable, that they were hemmed in, that there's nowhere that they could go. Pharaoh sent 600 chariots. Now understand that if you were a foot soldier, you didn't stand a chance against a chariot. They were too fast, they were too protected. It was kind of like looking at a tank. That's how the Israelites saw this threat, a bunch of tanks against them. Next, I want you to read Exodus chapter 14, next verses 10 through 12. Summarize their argument with Moses in your own words. And has there ever been a time in your life when you have said something similar to this to God? I'm going to be honest with you, as your pastor, I can't tell you how many times I have lost faith because I was going through a hard time. So that's completely normal if you've ever had a hard time with your faith in a tough time. But next I want you to read Exodus chapter 14, verses 13 through 15. How is it that Moses was able to have a faith when all the others around him had lost their faith? And what do you think God's perspective is when we lose faith? Personally, I believe that Moses was able to have this unusual faith because he had a thankful heart. Moses remembered all the ways that God had provided for them in the past, which gave him the ability to trust God for the future. If I were God, man, I would get frustrated with God's people. Because not just the Israelites, but also Christians, God proves himself to us over and over again. He must be asking the question, how many times do I have to prove myself to you people? Next, I want you to read Exodus chapter 14, verses 18 through 22. The Israelites thought that this was just about them. But in verse 18, who else was this about? How has God used a tough time in your life to influence others? And how should this change your perspective on the next challenge that you will face in your life? As we find out in verse 18, this was not just about the Israelites. This was also about the Egyptians finding out who the true God really was. In fact, this was about the entire known world at the time. And let me tell you something, after this event, after God rescued them, the entire world heard about how God had protected his people. You know, God uses these tough times to influence other people. I always say that God is in the business of 2-for-1s. And he will also often use one situation to speak to more than just one person. Let's read the rest of the story. Read Exodus chapter 14, verses 23 through 31. It's a little bit longer read. Do you think that the faith of the Israelites stayed firm after seeing this miracle? Why or why not? And how can a lifestyle of thanksgiving help us to have faith more like Moses? Next, and after you're done answering those two questions, I want you to close in prayer and ask that God would remind us to have a heart of thanksgiving. Thank you. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you on Sunday.